Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, listener. Greetings, fellow GM and or player. Welcome to episode 84 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and I'm transmitting to you today from the Obsidian Monolith somewhere outside time and space. So today I am going to do a feedback episode. The last regular episode of the show, I talked about, among other things, whether or not to hand out XP based on milestones or encounters. And I talked about using random encounters in RPGs and kind of gave my thoughts and opinions on both of those. And I've gotten some really great feedback on both of those topics. So I thought I would revisit them because there's still more to say about these topics. So first off, regarding the random encounters, I got a very nice email from Matt, who says he's been silently arguing with the podcast since GM Intrusions. So that's pretty sweet that Matt's been with me for so long, even though sounds like he has very different GMing style than what I do. So he mentions how in the discussion on random encounters, I made a comment, something along the lines of, if you roll on a table, it will most likely go badly for you. And then I proceeded to not really say anything more about that or clarify that or talk about exactly what I meant about that. And so he was kind of wondering where I was coming from on that. And Matt says, I was left confused as to what most likely go badly meant, but have you ever thought of the role like an improv prompt? So using what you roll on a random encounter as a prompt for improvisation. I find the challenge of taking the result and crafting an encounter that is both challenging and story appropriate to be lots of fun. So yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that could be really cool. I'm curious, Matt, if you're doing this during play or if you're doing this as part of your prep. Because unless you are really experienced and very well-versed and proficient with whatever system you're running, it seems to me personally that it would be a little rough to just grab an encounter off a table and craft an encounter around that during play. You know, it seems like that would be something that would take a little time to do and would be kind of hard to do just on the fly at the drop of a hat. But I don't know. Maybe you're doing it as part of your prep. I don't know. But to me, improv suggests that you're doing it during play, right? Because if you're prepping it, it's not really improv. Matt goes on to say, this has led to some highly entertaining encounters. Most recently, a meal shared with a random NPC whom half the party was convinced was the living avatar of Loth. Oh, the terrified glances. So I wrote back to Matt, but I thought for everyone's benefit, I would clarify a bit more by what I meant by that off the cuff comment about just rolling on a table and how that could go badly for you. Because yeah, I didn't elaborate on that at all. So unless you're a mind reader, you probably didn't even know what I was talking about there. So what I meant by that is that if you're using an encounter table from a published adventure and during play you're just rolling on it and just going with whatever you roll and letting the dice tell you what to do basically, and you're not thinking critically about what you're doing, things may very well end badly for you. You may hear me say this and kind of be like, well, who would do that? But it's amazing how many GMs do exactly that. They will roll something on a random encounter and they just do it. And they don't think about it or they don't adjust it or modify it to fit the party or to fit the situation or to fit the story. They just They just, oh, well, the dice rolled this, so this is what I'm doing. Then they get upset when they have a TPK or it doesn't work well for them. A classic example of this, which was kind of what I was thinking when I made that comment in the previous episode, is a random encounter table that was in the first book of Pathfinder's Kingmaker adventure path called Stolen Lands. And this encounter table contains both an owlbear and a will-o-wisp. And this is for a table that you're rolling on with potentially first level characters. And, you know, I started to run this adventure path back in my Pathfinder days. And on the Paizo forums, there were countless posts by GMs who were running this adventure, used that random encounter table, rolled an owlbear or a will-o-wisp for their first level party or even second level party, threw the encounter at them, and had a TPK. And so there was much discussion about what to do about this, anything from, well, just don't use those encounters if they come up, to kind of like what I was suggesting in the previous episode, which is, you know, you could use the owlbear, but maybe they see it in the distance, or maybe they see its tracks, or they see spore left behind by it. And it's something where they, quote unquote, encounter the owlbear, they see it, they know it's there, but they have the ability to avoid it and have it not be a combat encounter. And hopefully the GM is giving them some kind of hint that this is well beyond their capabilities. Same thing with the will-o-wisp. But again, if you're just, you know, kind of running this without thinking critically, and you roll that encounter for your level 1 group and you just run it as a combat encounter, you're probably going to have at least one PC death on your hands, if not the whole party. And I mean, I guess if that's fun for you, then have at it. But most of us would not consider that very much fun, either as GM or as a player. So that's kind of what I was referencing, that kind of situation. And, you know, obviously, if you're running your own homebrewed adventure and you're making your own encounter tables, then you're not going to have those problems because, well, you made the table, right? And you know what's on there, and you know what your PCs can handle and what they can't. But if you're running a published adventure, you know, you definitely want to look at those random encounter tables, because oftentimes what's happening, and this was the case in the Kingmaker adventure that I was just talking about, is that same table is used for a pretty wide spread of levels. I think in that particular adventure, it was anywhere from level 1 to level 5, right? So an encounter that's challenging for a level 5 party is going to be way too much for a level 1 party, right? So you'll see that a lot in published adventures where you'll have a fairly wide spread of difficulty within a given table. So if you're not planning ahead, or you're not thinking as a GM when you're running the game, and you're just going with whatever you roll and whatever happens, then you may end up with results that either you won't be happy with or your players won't be happy with. And not only could those results be PC deaths or a TPK, it could be just things like an encounter that just doesn't make sense because it's not in the right location, or it's not at the right time, right? It just doesn't make sense narratively that this encounter would happen in this time or place, right? Or maybe an encounter that's just way too easy and it's just boring and uninspired. So I don't think that a good GM who has very much experience with whatever the game is he's running or she's running, I don't think a good experienced GM is going to have these kinds of problems. But a newer GM or a less experienced GM might, or a GM who's thinking that because I'm running a published adventure, I don't really have to think about what I'm doing and I can just do what the adventure tells me and I'll be okay. That GM might have problems. So I would definitely recommend, if you are running a published adventure, you know, I've said before that's not an excuse not to do prep, and it doesn't remove the need to do prep at all. In fact, I think you need to do more prep for a published adventure. It also doesn't remove the need for you to think as a GM and think critically about what you're doing and what the consequences are going to be, right? Sometimes game designers make mistakes. Maybe there's something in that table that just shouldn't be there. Or, sometimes you have to look at something in a table and you have to kind of think about it a little bit, right? If it's an encounter table for a level 1 party, for a level 1 adventure, and there's a stone giant on there, well, then you should realize that this isn't supposed to be a combat encounter, right? I mean, if it's a good random encounter table, there's more than just combat encounters on there, right? Combat encounters should probably be half of the table or less, right? So maybe that stone giant should be a social encounter. Or maybe it's an encounter that the PCs need to sneak around or fly over or tunnel beneath or something. They have to find some way around it, not through it, right? So I talked about, using high-level encounters in low-level adventures in the previous episode. So I won't go off too much on that. But yeah, so that's kind of where I was coming from. Not to say that just any time you roll on a random encounter and if you just go with that, it's going to end badly. If it's a well-designed table and it's well-suited to your particular party, then you'll probably be fine. But, not all encounter tables are created equally, and even a very well-designed table can't anticipate your given party, right? So you got to think about your player characters too. Like I recently had a group in my Primordia campaign where they didn't really have any healers, and they also didn't really have much in the way of kind of frontline fighters, right? Now, I kind of took a different philosophy with that, where I was like, I'm not going to tailor my adventure to the PCs. It's kind of part of this adventure is a test to see if they can function together as a party. This was in my world of Primordia, where there is an adventurers guild and teams of adventurers go out into the world and make their fortunes or whatever, right? And so obviously a team of adventurers that doesn't have any healing capability has some serious drawbacks that they need to overcome, right? And that's the player's job to figure that out. That's not my job as a GM. The way I set up the campaign and the way I set up the Adventurers Guild is you guys need to be a well-equipped team, and if you're going to have a team without healers, then you need to demonstrate to the guild that you can be successful without healers in some way before they're even going to let you be part of the guild, right? You have to prove yourselves to them. And I'm not going to, for 20 levels of a campaign, softball all the encounters because you chose to have a party without healers, Again, consequences, right? Goes all the way to character creation. But if I was running a published adventure or even my own adventure and I knew I had a situation where, there are no healers in the party, then I need to remember that as I'm anticipating how difficult given encounters are going to be, right? And I need to realize that certain encounters, or maybe all the encounters, will actually be more difficult than they look on paper because the PCs don't have that healing ability, right? Which is not to say I shouldn't run them, but I just, I don't want to be blindsided and be facing a TPK that I didn't see coming, right? I want to kind of know what's going on and know what to expect. So, Matt, I hope I addressed your question and request for clarification. So yeah, that's the problem with doing an episode on the cuff like that, or off the cuff, is that, it wasn't as well thought out as my episodes normally are, because I usually write them ahead of time. So sometimes you can get into trouble. So just as preparation is vital for running a good role-playing session, it's also vital for doing a good podcast. But I'm really glad that Matt wrote in about this, because we can talk about it. And yeah, I think Matt's idea of using an encounter table for improv during your game is a really cool idea. Personally, if I was going to do that, I think I'd rather use an encounter table I made myself than one from a published adventure, unless I had already vetted that table and I knew that there weren't any surprises in it. Because if I'm going to roll on the table during play and kind of pull this encounter out of my ass during play, I don't want to derail the momentum of the game and kill the pacing and make the player sit there for 10 minutes while I figure out this encounter, right? I want a table where I can roll on it and I can just take that encounter and run with it. I don't have to sit there and think, is this going to be too hard or too easy? Do I need to change something about it, right? Because I'm not going to have time for that. I need to just be able to run with it. So personally, if I was going to do that and just determine them on the spot during play and then improvise it, I would make my own table. And again, you're going to end up with nonsensical results, right? So maybe your table has creatures that are found in or near a river because there's a river in the area, but at the time that you roll that encounter, they're nowhere near the river. So it wouldn't make sense for that creature to be there, right? So at that point, you either need to get really creative as to why that creature would be there, or roll again, or something else, right? Again, you got to think critically. You can't just, let the dice run the game for you, because it probably won't end well. All right, so the next topic is the XP topic. So I was discussing the various ways that you can advance player characters in a game like D&D where you have XP, where you can either do encounter-based XP, where they earn certain amounts of XP for certain encounters, or you can do what's called Milestone Xp, where you set certain story goals or objectives, and when the players reach those, then they get XP or they get a level or whatever. And then there's, the far side of the spectrum where you just, as a GM, you just level the PCs whenever you feel like it, and you're not even thinking about XP or what certain encounters are worth or anything like that. You're just hand waving it. So Simon Collins commented on this topic on Google+, and he says that there was a point I made in this episode that he disagreed with. All right, so basically Simon is saying that I was basing my preference for XP per encounter over milestones with the argument that, let's say in one session, the PCs get a lot accomplished, and in the second session, they don't get much of anything accomplished. With the XP per encounter method, they would get a lot more XP in that first session than they would in the second, and thereby the XP is rewarding them proportionately to what they accomplish in a given session. And Simon is basically saying that you can have the same kind of thing happening with milestones, because presumably in a less productive session, the players will be getting less milestones accomplished. So they will still, quote, suffer in terms of the speed at which they level up. Simon says, I felt that you blurred the lines between definitive milestones and the GM hand-wavy option of leveling up at that point in the podcast, which is a little unfair on definitive milestones. So yeah, Simon's totally right. I did totally do that. I listened to the podcast again myself, and it sounds very much by what I'm saying that I'm thinking of a milestone being a level's worth of XP, which you can do it that way. And I've known GMs that do it that way. Like they don't, when you get XP, you just level. They don't give you like fractions of a level of XP. They just wait until you've accumulated enough to level, and then they're like, okay, you level. But milestones actually, as described in the DMG, are more, you have multiple milestones in a given level. So you as a GM decide, okay, these points in my story are milestones. Like the first milestone is when the PCs discover that goblins are behind the attacks on this village. And the second milestone is when they defeat the goblins, and so on, right? And then you set XP amounts for those milestones, and that could be XP equivalent to a certain encounter that they might do at that level, or whatever the amounts are. So yeah, Simon's totally right. I was getting a little vague there, definitely causing some confusion. He also points out that there are other in-game rewards that players' characters gain, things like treasure, magic, contacts, boons, things like that. So even if you're doing the hand wavy just giving XP whenever you feel like it. There are still rewards that they get in the game that are based on what they do, which is a valid point. He says XP is only one of several ways to reward players to encourage certain behavior you want to see in your game. And I totally agree. And inspiration in D&D is another reward. I really like XP as reward, and it's just yet another reward. And I like the system to be transparent to the players so that they know what they're getting rewarded or how much they're getting rewarded for what, right? So if I'm awarding XP the same no matter how they overcome the obstacle. So let's say the obstacle is a stone giant, and the amount of XP that the players earn doesn't matter how they overcome the obstacle. It just matters that they overcome it, right? Well, I should let the players know that, right? Because for all I know, they've played for some other GM who said, oh, if you don't fight the stone giant, then you don't get any XP, or you only get half or a quarter or whatever, right? And that's not the way I do it. I don't think that's the way you should do it. I don't think, I guess if you want murder hobos in your game, then that's the way to do it. But if you want your game to be more than just about combat, I think that you should reward all methods equally. The idea is, I as a GM, I put this obstacle in front of you. That obstacle could be a stone giant. It could be a wall you have to climb. It could be a ravine you have to cross. It could be a raging river you have to cross, right? And I determine this obstacle is worth 300 XP, right? To earn that 300 XP, you must overcome the obstacle. How you do that is completely up to you. And that way there's a built-in reward for finding the easier way, right? So let's take the stone giant example. Let's say your player characters are level 5. Stone giant's a CR 7. So even for a level 5 party, they probably don't have a hope of defeating it, right? So they could go for the combat option, and very likely some or all of them die and earn that 900 XP or whatever it is, right? Or they could talk to the stone giant, maybe find out something it wants that they can provide as a bribe to get past it. That's a lot easier than a TPK, but the same XP payout. They still get 900 XP. Or maybe they just sneak by the stone giant, or they wait for him to fall asleep and then sneak by the stone giant. Even easier, right? But they still get the same amount of XP. And that way you're rewarding the smart thinking, because it's like, well, the XP is the same regardless, right? So I am encouraging you to find the easiest, safest way to do it and put some thought into it, because it's a much safer, more guaranteed way to earn that XP than if you go try to fight something, right? So yeah. But yeah, Simon's totally right. I was getting a little confused there and equating milestones with, getting a level's worth of XP all at once, and that's definitely not the way that you have to do it. I mean, you can make those milestones as big or as small as you want, right? So in a given level, you could have 5 milestones or you could have 20. It's totally up to you as a GM. And I think the big thing there is, if you're doing milestones, is I would let the players know what the milestones are and what they're getting for them. Just like with using the encounter-based XP and telling them, oh, the stone giant's worth this much XP. It doesn't matter how you overcome it. It's still worth the same amount. So feel free to role play your way around it if you can. You'll get the same amount of XP, right? So the same thing with milestones. You might want to tell your players, well, you've achieved this milestone now and you're getting this much XP because of it. So there you go. And one thing that one argument I've heard for the milestone, or even just the hand wavy method, is that some GMs feel that it may help alleviate some of the murder hobo-ness, because then you don't have the thing of the PCs being like, oh, we only need 10 more XP to level. Let's go out in the woods and kill something, right? And there might be something to that if the alternative is you only get XP for combat, right? But if you're doing it where you get XP for any method, including combat, then, well, they could just as easily go find something out in the woods and talk to it and beat it in a riddle contest or something to get that 10 XP, right? They don't have to go kill something. So also regarding this XP topic, Thomas Chapman commented on Google Plus as well, and he has another counterpoint to the discussion. And he points out that although he's a big fan of the, regular encounter-based XP system, he doesn't use it when he's running published stuff, for instance, adventure paths. Because the plot is so scripted and encounters are pre-planned, it makes sense for me to do it this way. In fact, in newer adventure paths, Paizo includes a page in each publication that says, by this point, the party should be level X. And Tyranny of Dragons was the same way. It was chapter based. So they'd be like, okay, the party should level at the end of this chapter and they should be level 8 or whatever. So it made doing just, they called it Milestone XP, but it wasn't, I guess it was sort of Milestone, but I guess that's why I was using the assumption of the milestone is a whole level, because that's how Tyranny of Dragons was. It wasn't like, oh, they get 300 XP at this point. It's like they advance to the next level at this point, and that's how those milestones worked. So if that's the way the adventure is set up that you're running, definitely I would do it that way, because it's set up that way. It's just going to be easier to do it that way, and you don't have to sit there and figure out XP and do all this extra work. Thomas goes on to say, I tried to run these awarding XP once and stopped very quickly. In addition to prepping the main plot, which, as you have said before, takes way more time than it should with published games, I then needed to prep this side quest that pulls the party away from the story they're involved in just to make sure they are the correct level. This wasn't worth it to me. Yeah, and I've run into that too. I personally would call that poor design on the part of the people designing the adventure path. The published adventure should have enough in it to get the players where they need to be XP wise. You shouldn't, when you're spending that much money for an adventure, you as a GM shouldn't have to come up with extra shit just so that their progression is what it should be for the adventure, right? So I would call that poor design, but I've definitely seen that in like the Paizo adventure paths and other published adventures as well, where if you're handing out XP based on encounters, there's not enough, and you have to come up with additional stuff. And like Thomas said, it's either just random shit that doesn't tie into anything at all, which sometimes can be good, or, you're having to come up with some way to add more encounters into this story somehow. So he said, there are, of course, some drawbacks to, using the more milestone type XP with an adventure path. He says one issue I ran into with my group when running Curse of the Crimson Throne is that the players who were able to show up each week were progressing at the same rate as those that were pulled away for work or just didn't show up. I had to balance the desires of the players with the demands of the publication, as I didn't want to buy the product and then rewrite it. Yeah, that's another problem with these published campaigns. So the way Thomas overcame this problem was he ended up coming up with a system where basically people that were at the game on time got a bonus to a roll or got a re-roll and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, that's a way to go about it. It seems a little convoluted to me, but again, he's trying to make the best of a bad situation that this adventure path is putting him into. And so that is one benefit to having smaller milestones and more of them is, if you're doing like a milestone is a level worth of XP, then, you could have a player who misses 3 out of 4 sessions, but he happens to be there the session that they hit the milestone and his character levels because he was there. And, he's there a quarter of the time and he's the same level as everybody else who's there every time, right? Or on the flip side, you could have a player that's there every session and they just happen to miss the session where the milestone was reached, and now they don't get any XP, and now they're a level behind everybody else just because they missed one session, right? So obviously that doesn't seem fair or right. It seems broken. So now you as a GM have to figure out how you're going to handle that, right? And you have to do some juggling or whatnot, which again, I feel like just doing the encounter-based XP would be a lot easier. Now, if you're doing smaller milestones, then it's not as big of a deal, especially if you're designing it in such a way that they're hitting at least one of those milestones every session. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely different ways to do it, different ways to deal with it. And yeah, you can do like Thomas does and just give everybody all the XP, whether they're there or not, and then come up with some other benefit that the players who actually show up have. But personally, to me, that just seems a little backwards. It's like I'm rewarding everybody and then I'm giving extra rewards for the people that actually show up. I think it's a lot easier and simpler just not to reward the people that don't show up. It's like in a video game, right? There's lots of video games these days where you earn XP, right? You have to play the game to earn the XP, usually. Right? You can't just like not play for a month and come up and, oh my God, my character gained 5 levels while I wasn't playing. Yeah, it doesn't work like that. You have to earn it, right? So yeah, there's some feedback on those topics. And again, this is just the way I do it. This is just my opinion. These aren't really right or wrong answers. There are people that, reward their players whether they come or not. And it works fine for them, so that's awesome. I'm not saying that my way is the only way. It's just what works for me. And I always like hearing from people that have different opinions and different ways of doing things. So this is really interesting. So I want to thank Matt and Simon and Thomas for their feedback on the episode. And yeah, kind of had fun with these topics. I think it's kind of a can of worms because there are so many different ways that GMs award XP or advance player characters. And this is assuming we're talking about D&D or a game very similar to it, like Pathfinder or something, right? Then you get into different systems that have very different ways of doing character advancement, and it gets even more complicated. And there's also a pretty wide spectrum of how people handle random encounters, all the way from people who just don't use them and hate them and will never do a random encounter, all the way to people that will literally roll on a table and do whatever the dice tell them, and whatever happens, and then everywhere in between, which is probably where most of us are. And I guess my main goal with the random encounter bit was for any of you who maybe are like, I don't use random encounters, I think they're bad, to kind of give you maybe a different way to approach it, to where you can actually use random encounters but not have them be really random. And when you do that, you avoid pretty much all of the issues that people commonly have with random encounters. Either the encounter's too hard, or it's too easy, or it doesn't fit the story, it doesn't make sense, or it's just not very much fun, or it's just, it's not interesting, right? It's just a random encounter, and your players are like, oh goody, another random encounter, another boring humdrum, encounter, right? So you can avoid all of those problems by giving some thought to your encounters ahead of time. And, that could be anything from actually creating the encounter and deciding how much of everything there is and where it takes place and what kind of environmental things might be going on, which is what I do. Or you could just look at your table and give each of those entries some thought and think about, okay, if I roll this, what could I do with it? Right? And if you're doing that, definitely look for any possible problems, like anything that might be too powerful, or might seem too mundane or too boring, or might be too easy, or might not fit, or might just be really deadly against your particular party because maybe they don't have a healer, or they don't have any ranged weapons, or whatever, right? Throwing a flying creature at a party without any ranged attacks, is far more deadly than a party where everybody's got ranged attacks, right? So I would just look for possible problems and, not necessarily just take that off the table, although you can do that, but maybe think, well, is there a way I can use this in a different way. You know, maybe instead of having the red dragon flying over the party, breathing fire on them until they die because they have no ranged weapons, maybe it wants something. Maybe it has a scheme it wants to use them in, or maybe they can appeal to its vanity and talk their way out of it. I don't know. There's always options and alternatives, right? So that's going to wrap up episode 84 of Game Master's Journey. Thank you so much for joining me on my journey again today. If you'd like to reach me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Google plus Lex Starwalker, and you can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. Please visit my website, starwalkerstudios.com. You can find all the episodes there and all the show notes. You can also find my other podcasts there. I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 5 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve. Woo! Yeah. There we go, Steve. You're the man. Really appreciate all the patrons who support the show and support Starwalker Studios. Could not do it without you. If you would like to learn about becoming a patron, just click on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. Also at the bottom of the show notes, there are lots of ways that you can help support the podcast and support Starwalker Studios. Some of them won't even cost you any money. So definitely check that out. Really appreciate everybody's support. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.